ran a little last year, ran a little overtime. Apologize. Again, we're learning Leilin Ishmus Yehuda Shimon Zechron Rocha ben Yeshua Yosef Moshe and Ayalev Zechron Rocha ben Yeshua Adam Zalman. The neshamas should have an aliyah. Okay, so I don't know if anybody has been getting a little tired of this buses sugya, but there have been some questions I wanted to clarify that came up last week, and some that people texted me during the week about it. So I want to just try and clarify it, and I hope I'm not overstepping my welcome with this buses business. But I mean, it comes up a lot. So the buses issue comes up a lot. So so I just want to make sure we have it clear. Again, buses ledovar also is something where if you have muktza resting on something by ben hashmashas, which we're going to discuss it, ben hashmashas, exactly what that is soon, Bez Hashem. So it basically, that item that the muktza is sitting on becomes muktza. Even if the muktza gets removed before Shabbos, not before Shabbos, I'm sorry, even if the muktza gets removed on Shabbos, the item that the muktza was resting on becomes muktza, was muktza, and remains muktza throughout the whole Shabbos. So we said that the common example is the candlestick sitting on the table. So if they're sitting on the table, then the table becomes muktza. Another common case is you find muktza in your pocket, like your coat, especially if you don't have a Shabbos coat, and you are wearing your weekday coat, and then you feel in the pocket, and the pocket has muktza in it. So now the question is, does the whole coat become muktza? Which we said it really depends on what type of pocket. From what I understand, most pockets in coats are separate entities. It's not like a shirt pocket where the pocket is part of the shirt. So it's a separate entity. So therefore, the pocket will be muktza, but the coat won't be muktza. So what you do is you just knock out the muktza from the coat, and then you'll be fine. Right? Now, the drawers, we left off last week with the drawers, and I want to just make sure that we're clear with that because it comes up a lot. So if you have drawers, what people call junk drawers in the kitchen, that's the thing that it happens to the most, and there's muktza in those drawers. So are you allowed to open up those drawers on Shabbos if you know there's muktza in there? So basically what we've said is that when you have something that's muktza and non-muktza on a table or on anything, then depending on what's worth more, that's what will create the status. Meaning, if your table is set Friday night and your table has candlesticks on it and the challah, so we said even though candlesticks are worth more than challah or wine or sidurim or whatever it is, but since it's done for a mitzvah, for Shabbos, so therefore your table goes with the more chashuv, which is the challah, because it's the covered Shabbos, right? But even if not, let's say you had silverware that's worth more than your candlesticks, and then your table will not be muktza. Your table will be fine to be moved, because when something is a basis for mutter and iser, we go with what's worth more, right? So if you have the candlestick sitting on the table and you have other items on that table that are worth more than the candlesticks, then your table is not going to be muktza. Now, you can't move the table with the candlesticks on it because you're moving muktza, which we'll get to. We'll try and get to that. But the drawer, so you have to figure out in your kitchen drawer if the muktza is worth more than your non-muktza, or if your non-muktza is worth more than the muktza. Right? So whichever is worth more, then that drawer will no longer be muktza. Right? So that's basically the question. So again, if you have in your drawer, you have a corkscrew. That's a common shiloh. So you have a corkscrew in a drawer together with pens and pencils and stuff like that. So probably the corkscrew is going to be worth more than the pens and pencils. So therefore, you are okay with opening that drawer, right? The question, and then you have to figure out for yourself. You have to figure out for yourself what's worth more. The problem is that a lot of times the stuff that you just dump into this drawer are not worth. Neither thing is worth too much. So since neither thing is worth too much, so then what are you going to do? What are you going to do with that, right? So then you just have to try and figure out what's worth more to you. Now, here's where I think there was some lack of clarity on my part to try and explain it. So, but now let's say you know that in your drawer there's going to be Muktza together with non-Muktza. So now what's going to be? Are you allowed to open that drawer? So we discussed that when you have the Muktza and the non-Muktza on, let's say, the table, so then and you want to move the table, so what you have to do, because you're moving the table with the candlesticks on it. So what you're supposed to try and do is knock the candlesticks off to the floor, and then you can move the table at will. The problem is that nobody wants to knock candlesticks off onto the floor. So since you don't want to knock candlesticks off onto the floor, so then now what do you do? So then what the person say you could do is you can carry the table and to someplace where it would be safe to remove the candlesticks, and then that would be okay, right? But if you can't do that, then you are allowed to move the table, no problem. So the same thing would apply to the drawer. If you can knock off the Muktza before you move the drawer, but you open the drawer, then that would be okay. But if you can't knock off the Muktza, then you would be allowed to move it. Now that's not easy to do when something's in a drawer, right? Because you want to try and knock it. You want to try and knock the table you're not really moving any Muktza, but in a drawer, you're not going to be able to keep hitting the drawer until the Muktza flies off of it. That's what I'm assuming not. So in that case, you can open the drawer, because push comes to shove, you would be allowed to move the Muktza that way, because that's not, next week, I'd like to discuss exactly the parameters of when you're allowed to move Muktza. We've been saying over the last bunch of weeks that there's a way to move all types of every Muktza can be moved in some way, shape, or form. We haven't discussed that yet. Next week, I'd like to get to how we go about moving Muktza and what are the best ways of doing it. But push comes to shove, you're allowed to open up the drawer, even though you're moving the non-Muktza. But again, that has to be if what's in the drawer, the non-Muktza, is worth more than the Muktza. If the non-Muktza has to be worth more than the Muktza, or it has to be something like a siddur. Like if you have a siddur in a drawer and you know it's full of pens, so then you'd be allowed to open the drawer, because the siddur is considered more chashuv. It's a disagreement in the poskim whether that applies, but we are lenient, and you would be allowed to open the drawer with a siddur in it, even though there's also Muktza in it. Okay, so just to be clear, if you have those drawers in the kitchen and you open up a drawer on Shabbos to get something, say, oh no, there's Muktza in there. Usually it's not a problem, because what you're looking for is going to be worth more than the other Muktza, and then it's going to be okay. If it's not, and you open the drawer and you realize that you have a Muktza item in there that's worth a lot of money, like, for example, a smartphone, and it's worth much, it's worth much more than anything else in the drawer, then really you can't shut the drawer. Now, you will be able to shut the drawer with the shinoi, right? So that's what we said we'll discuss next week, Be'ez Hashem, but you really can shut the drawer with a shinoi, but really regular shutting you shouldn't do if that's what you realize. But I wouldn't worry about that. In most scenarios, the Muktza is worth less, but that theoretically would be the case. Okay, so one second before we continue, there's a couple of questions here. Yes, if there's a dresser or break front has Muktza on it and there are attached doors, you can open the doors. Yes, you can open the doors because the bottom is not. It's a big disagreement, but you can open the doors to get into you can get into there, right? And I'll explain to you another leniency that's very important with all these halachas. No, it doesn't go with what you need at the moment. It goes with what you always consider, right? Somebody's asking, is it if what you needed at the moment? No, that doesn't work like that. It has to do with what do you, on your steady basis, on a normal situation, what do you look at as more chashuv? Yeah, so lechatchila, move the muktza, and b'diavad you can move the drawer. Yes, you open the drawer even if you can't move it. But again, that's assuming that the drawer is not full of muktza, and that the muktza is worth less than the non-muktza. If the muktza is worth more than the non-muktza, then you're not allowed to go into that drawer. Now, I think last week I said that you should, before Shabbos, if you know you're going to have to go into this drawer, then you should remove all the muktza. Not everybody agrees that you have to go that far to remove the muktza from the drawer. You certainly, if you're not sure whether you're going to use these drawers or not, we don't have to add that to your list of Erev Shabbos as hectic enough. You would not have to add that to your list of things to do before Shabbos, to go look at all the drawers that you could potentially go into to get something and you need something. You're not required to do that. If you happen to know that you're going to be using a drawer that has a corkscrew or something like that in the drawer, and you know that there's muktza in it, so then if you have the sense of mind to do this before Shabbos, then it would be better. Then it would be better to do that, but not required. Not required, right? So now, so somebody's saying that once you took out the corkscrew and you realize that it's again, I'm not sure what you're asking with the corkscrew, but again, if the corkscrew is worth more than all the other muktza and you open up the drawer, then even though you took the corkscrew out, that drawer is still not muktza because we consider it non-muktza because the more expensive thing in the drawer was the non-muktza. I hope I'm being clear. Meaning, even though let's say you have a corkscrew and 2 pens you have a corkscrew and 2 pens in the drawer. Let's just take a basic case, right? And you took out the corkscrew. So now the drawer has just 2 pens in it. The draw's still not considered muktza because it all works with what went on in Bein Hashmashos, which we're going to get to in a few minutes. It's all dependent on what the status was Bein Hashmashos. In Bein Hashmashos, meaning from when Shabbos starts until nightfall, which we say is approximately 42 minutes after sunset, after Shkia, right? So as long as that corkscrew was in there during that time, that drawer will remain non-muktza, even if there's only muktza things in there on Shabbos. So you would be able to close the door because you're not directly moving the muktza. But the opposite works too. Let's say that corkscrew, you had it out before Shabbos, and then somebody by mistake or a cleaning lady put that corkscrew into the muktza drawer, and there was only muktza in that drawer, then you are not allowed to open that drawer. It's all dependent on what was there when Shabbos started. Okay? Parenthetically, just to say something interesting, let's say you make early Shabbos, and the corkscrew was in the drawer early Shabbos, but then you took it out before Shkia because you made early Shabbos. It doesn't go with when your Shabbos starts. It goes with from sunset till nightfall. So that could work as a leniency and a stringency. Meaning, if you took the corkscrew out before Shabbos, before the real Shabbos, meaning before Shkia, then it will be muktza, right? And then the opposite would be also true. Meaning, it doesn't go with when you make Shabbos. It goes with from Shkia until nightfall, right? So basically, again, once you move the drawer, once you remove the corkscrew from the drawer, so then you're going to be fine. Now, I just lost the question. Let me try and find them. Okay, yeah. Okay, so what else? I hope that answered that question. Okay, so now on the buffet server, can you open, and the candles on it, can you open the drawers? Yes, you can, because that's called an indirect movement of muktza, which again, Bez Hashem will do next week. That would be an indirect muktza. The question is that was a question before, is opening the doors. Maybe the whole buffet is muktza, so how are you allowed to even open the doors, right? So we said that it's okay, and now we'll get into exactly why that would be okay, right? So benchers, so a door that has, that's also a common question. You have the Havdalah stuff, which is muktza, and you have benches in there, so the benches is always going to be more chashuv. Anything having to do with Yiddishkeit is going to be considered more chashuv than and you need the Siddurim for Shabbos, even though Havdalah also has to do with Yiddishkeit, but you need that for the benches for Shabbos, so therefore that's going to be fine. Now, something that's important to understand with this, and this is a big leniency, which takes care of a lot of the stress and a lot of the issues with this halacha, and that is we know, I hope we remember this a little bit, but there's something called kli shemalachta. So one of the major muksas is you could have something muksa, but if it's a utensil that's muksa, then you're allowed to move that muksa if you need it, if you need the utensil, or if you need the place where the utensil is. Again, the classic example is using a hammer, right? So we said that a hammer is muksa, but if somebody leaves a hammer on the table from before Shabbos and you really need the place where the hammer is, so you're allowed to move that hammer, no problem. Just pick up the hammer. You don't need a shino. You don't need any difference. Just pick up the hammer and put it away. If you need the hammer to break open walnuts, so then you just take the hammer and you break open your walnuts, and you're allowed to do that with anything, right? So we said that almost all utensils that have a use for any sort of use can be considered a kli shemalachta le'isr, in which case it can be moved, right? So now the candlesticks maybe doesn't fall into this because it's they're expensive, right? So since they're expensive, you wouldn't call that a kli shemalachta le'isr, because that's a kli that you would never move unless it's its intended purpose. But if it's a kli, like a pencil or a pen, we said that a pen or a pencil can be used as a kli. Let's say you needed to scratch your head, or you needed it to, I don't know, whatever other uses could be. With scratching, that would be, right? So you take a pen or pencil and you use it to scratch your head, or to use it to open something up, to open up a can if you're having a hard time opening the can, so you want to, wedge the edge of the pencil under the whatever you call it, the spout. So now that would be okay on Shabbos. So if you're allowed to move the actual muktza, and that actual muktza is sitting on something, so then you should be able to move the item that it's sitting on. So for example, if you have a hammer that you purposely kept on the table from before Shabbos, for whatever reason, you kept the hammer on the table from before Shabbos purposely. So therefore, that table becomes muktza, even after the hammer gets removed. But some poskim say, many poskim say, well, since you're allowed to move that hammer, so then how could that hammer be more muktza? How could the table be more muktza than the hammer, right? I'm hoping being clear with this. Meaning, if the hammer is muktza, but it's a limited muktza, because if you need the hammer, you're allowed to move the hammer. So then the table that became muktza because of the hammer, you should be able to also move if you need the table to be moved, because how can you say that the table becomes more muktza than the hammer? Which is basically what I don't know if the majority of poskim say, but that's we will go with that opinion and say that if your item became muktza because of something that can be moved, therefore it can be moved. So a lot of these muktzas in the kitchen are considered like utensils, like the pens and the pencils, like even a smartphone, we said for many can be considered a utensil. So if it's considered a utensil, then that drawer will not become muktza. So really, it would depend on your candlesticks. If you have candlesticks on a buffet, right? So if they were lit for Shabbos, so then maybe you'd have a problem. But if they were not lit, and you would normally move these candlesticks around because you want to show them off, okay, I'm just making up a scenario, then it could be that even the candlesticks will not become muktza, but it would depend on how expensive they are, et cetera, et cetera. But that's also something to keep in mind, that the item that the muktza is resting on will not become muktza unless it's something that you absolutely can't move. Like we said, a rock can't become a utensil unless you specify it from before Shabbos. Okay, I hope that I'm being clear with that. And now that we took care of that, so then we can move on to another subject, which is similar to this, which is what we call migudis katsoi. The whole phrase is migudis katsoi will ben hashmashas. Since it's muktza ben hashmashas, it's katsoi l'chol yoma. It's muktza for the entire day, which basically means that whatever status this item has during ben hashmashas, which we said is from sunset till nightfall, approximately 42 minutes. In Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be shorter. It's going to be shorter than 42 minutes in Eretz Yisrael because of where they are in the world. That Ben Hashmash's twilight is much shorter there, but that's a different subject for a different time. But either way, if something's muksa going into Shabbos, then it will remain muksa for the rest of Shabbos, right? So that's what we've been saying, that if the candlesticks are on the table, Ben Hashmash's, then it's going to be muksa the whole Shabbos. But let's say somebody, for whatever reason, removes the candlesticks before nightfall, then the table will not be muksa the whole Shabbos. Okay, so now this halacha plays into quite a few things, and it's a common question: is wet clothing? Wet clothing is, I think, the most common of all the questions, and that is clothing that was wet bein hashmashas and then it dries over Shabbos. Is it considered muksa or not? Now, the reason why it should be considered muksa is because clothing that's wet, you can't move because we're afraid that you're going to squeeze it out on Shabbos, which could be an issa d'oraisa of squeezing, right? So wet clothing you have no need for. Like we've said, the yesod for muksa is that it's something that you don't plan on moving on Shabbos. As if you don't plan on moving at Shabbos, then it's muksa. So the question is your wet clothing, when it's wet ben hashmashas, so you say, okay, it's muksa ben hashmashas, I'm not allowed to move it. So now, even though it dried, by Shabbos morning it dried, maybe I shouldn't be able to use that clothing. So, like with everything else in Hilchos Shabbos, it can really depend on the scenario. Now, muksa ben hashmashas, basically what it has to do is it's got to be muksa that was man-made. I'm sorry, I'm just not feeling well. It has to be man-made muksa, right? If it's naturally going, if it's something natural, then it's not going to be muksa. For example, you have fruit sitting on the windowsill waiting for it to become ripe, or vegetables waiting on the windowsill to become ripe. So if it became ripe Shabbos morning, meaning Friday night when Shabbos came in, it was not ripe. Okay, so it was not ripe. You didn't plan on using this fruit, so it should be muksa. But if it became naturally by Shabbos morning, you realize Shabbos morning it became ripe. Again, I don't know if that's such a normal scenario, but let's say that this is what the place can discuss. Then that fruit, since it happened all naturally, that fruit would not be muksa, and it's okay. Right? Same thing is if you put up food to cook right before Shabbos. Right? So if you put up food right before Shabbos to cook, and it's not ready yet. So you think, okay, so the food's not ready. I don't plan on eating it now. I can't eat it now. So in the l'chayra, it's muksa. All right, it's like raw meat or raw food. So it's muksa. So know that it's not muksa because nature, even though you're the one that made the nature happen by putting it into a crock pot or into the oven, whatever it is, but since the regular nature of it is that it's going to become edible, therefore it's not muksa, right? But if you purposely made it yourself into a situation of muksa, then that's not going to work. And this is where the halacha can change things. If the halacha that the Gemara discusses is if you take fruit, so back then the way they preserved their fruit, they didn't have refrigeration. So the way they preserved their fruit is they put it up on the roof in the sun during the sunny season. Obviously, it wouldn't work in the winter. And you put it up in the sunny season and you wait for it to dry, right? So that's not the same case as putting your fruit, waiting for it to get ripe. That's just waiting for nature to take its course. Here, you took fruit that was not muksa, fully edible, and you made it muksa by putting it up on the roof and you say, okay, I'm not dealing with this anymore, this fruit, because I'm waiting for it to become dry fruit. Then I'm going to take it off the roof and put it away for the winter. All right, so that's how they had fruit. So doing that means you went and actively took this fruit and made it muksaf. So if that's the case, and Shabbos morning you go up to your roof and you happen to notice that the fruit became dry and it's ready to be edible, it now became edible again, then it's really, then you can't have it because it retains its muksa status. Okay, so that's basically what it is. So if it's something natural, then it's okay, and it's not muksa. If it's something not natural, then it is going to be muksa. So this is where the situation can be so different. If you ask a shaila, if you have wet clothing from before Shabbos, can it be worn once it got dry? So the answer is going to be tully. And could we have naturally expected this clothing to dry over Shabbos by itself, or by something that you did? Meaning, do we compare it to the food? Do we compare it to the food that you put up that made it not edible, or that wasn't yet ready, but it's going? If the nature takes its course the way it's supposed to be, assuming no blackouts and something like that, then your food is going to get cooked, in which case it's fine. Or do we look at it like somebody who purposely put his fruits onto the roof and dried it, in which case it's not fine, right? So drying depends where you're drying your clothing. If you put the clothing into the dryer before Shabbos, so now obviously you're putting it in before Shabbos. Now, since if nature takes its course, your clothing was expected to be dry over Shabbos, right? Even if it's not going to get dry ben hashmashas, but for sure if it was dry before ben hashmashas, it's not a problem, right? But if it was expected to be dried over Shabbos, then you can use it because that was what's expected, and it was not. Again, Muktza is all about what was in your head. So since in your head you expected this clothing to be dry, so therefore it's not Muktza, and you're allowed to use that clothing on Shabbos, even though it was Muktza ben hashmashas because it was wet. However, if you put your clothing on a laundry line on Shabbos, like a wet bathing suit or wet towels from the pool, outside you have no idea what the weather is. You have no idea. You have no idea if it's going to rain in the middle of the night. You know that it's going to take a good bunch of hours to dry. But if it rains in the middle of the night, or if it's extremely humid outside, then your stuff is not going to dry. I'm assuming that this is a common. Everybody that hangs their stuff out to dry, you don't know. It could take hours. It could take, depending if it's really hot, it can go very fast. So therefore, the Pais can say that if you hung it on a line outside, since you can't have any idea what the weather is, therefore, even if it gets dry on Shabbos, you're not allowed to take it. You're not allowed to take it. Now, there could be a different issue of using a tree. That's also not a subject for now to take it off from the tree. But forgetting now, just sticking to Muktza. So outside, the stuff is going to be Muktza, even though it's dry Shabbos morning. But in a dryer, then you could expect it to be dried, and therefore you are going to be fine with the dried clothing. Now you're going to say, okay, the dryer is Muktza, right? Which is true, the dryer is Muktza. But the Paz can say that a dryer is a kli shemalach d'isser. It's a utensil that's meant to do isser. And if you need to move that utensil for a good reason, then you're allowed to. So therefore, opening the dryer door, as long as the light doesn't go on, is going to be okay, right? Then that would be okay. Okay, so now some are asking about hanging on a line inside but not in a dryer. Again, you're going to have to know how it behaves, right? Again, you also have to know how wet the clothing was. And you have to know how dry it is, meaning if it's in the winter and the heat's blasting, and you know for sure with 100% certainty that it's going to dry before Shabbos, then it won't be Muktza. If you're not 100% certain, because sometimes it's not hot enough in there, etc., then it would be Muktza. Again, you have to be 100% sure that it will dry. When you put stuff into a dryer, and if your dryer is not working well, then maybe that wouldn't be 100% either. But if you have to base it on your prior experience with how these things dry. Excuse me. If it's going to dry for sure on Shabbos, then you're going to be okay. If you're not sure, then it's not okay. So the assumption is stuff that's hanging on a line outside, you can't be 100% sure. And the stuff that's inside, I don't know. It depends on it. You have to know how fast the stuff dries. I would think that people are not necessarily sure, but the truth is, after 12, 18 hours of drying inside a house, l'chayra should dry. It's interesting because some places can say that's all in United States, where we don't know our weather, right? You could have a rainstorm in the middle of the summer, assuming this all takes place in the summer. But in Eretz Yisrael, where it doesn't rain for 5 months straight, right? Nobody thinks it's going to rain in the summer. They know, and it's hot there too. They know when you hang out a bathing suit on a Friday right before Shabbos to dry, or a towel, then they know good and well that that's going to be dry. So someone is saying that based on the climate, it could change, right? Yeah. So that's that. No. So clothing that gets wet on Shabbos from a rainstorm is not going to be muktza. I mean, it's going to be muktza to move it around, but it's not going. It wasn't muktza ben hashmashas. So therefore, if it dries by itself, that's going to be okay. There is a halacha though. There is a halacha that clothing that gets wet on Shabbos, because of maras ayin, you're not allowed to hang it up in a place where people are going to see you hanging it on Shabbos, and that means even indoors where people are not going to see, because we know anything that's from maras ayin is even indoors. You're not allowed to hang it up on let's say you have a rack inside the house that something got wet in a rainstorm. You cannot hang it up in a place that you normally would hang wet clothing, because that's maras ayin, because it looks like you did laundry on Shabbos, right? So you'd have to hang it in a different place. Like let's say you hang it on the banister, the coat that comes in, you hang it on a banister, so nobody's going to think you're hanging it there because you did laundry, right? Unless you're yeshiva bacher, and that's the normal place that you dry your clothing, so then maybe that would be maras ayin too. But unless it's something that you would never, let's say something that you would dry clean only, then nobody's going to be concerned that you washed it. So then that would be okay, but that's a different subject. Yeah. So now it doesn't. You have to know your clothing and you have to know your laundry and know whether it's going to where and when how it's going to dry. Right. So that's okay. So that's basically it for that. So again, migud eskatzoi lebein hashmashos. Something's muksa lebein hashmashos. It's going to be muksa for the whole Shabbos. So therefore, again, if you actively, it has to be you actively make it muksa. If you actively make it muksa, then it will remain muksa for the whole Shabbos, unless you know with 100% certainty that it's going to become usable on Shabbos, in which case it's okay. Now, running a dryer before Shabbos, so Rabbi Feinstein is quoted as saying that you are not allowed to run a dryer before Shabbos to run on Shabbos, because it makes a lot of noise, and making noise is a disruption of Shabbos. Same thing that would be with running a dishwasher right before Shabbos. However, it really would depend. What many persons say is depends where the dryer is, and it depends where the dishwasher is, and also depends on how loud they are. I would imagine that dishwashers nowadays are a lot quieter than they were in Rabbi Feinstein's some days. So a lot of persons say you can't even tell when you walk into the kitchen whether the dishwasher isn't even making noise. Same thing with a dryer. Dryers are pretty quiet. And especially if they're in a part of the house where nobody goes, so then that loud noise or whatever noise it's making is not disturbing. So therefore you would be, according to those places, you would be allowed to put on the dryer right before Shabbos, which is, from what I understand, that's the way most contemporary, I don't want to say most, many contemporary places say that as long as the dryer is not in a central place in the house, then it would be mutter to run the dryer from before Shabbos. Okay, so I think that's enough for tonight. So next week, Bez Hashem, will be, I think, the last shir on Hilchos Muktza. I think we covered pretty much everything. If anybody has any questions, you can post it now. And we'll discuss, Bez Hashem, all the ways you move Muktza, and then maybe a week after. I don't think the week after that I won't be able to be there. But maybe after that, we'll just do a quick chazara of all Muktza, and then we can take votes of exactly what subject we want to do after that. Okay, so somebody is just posting. Yes, anything that you need for religious purposes is considered more chashuv, even more than the most chashuv things. Yes, that's the way it works. That's the way we so yeah, towels on the floor should be really hung before Shabbos. To hang them on Shabbos is a problem. You should, yeah, you can move them you can move them if you did they're it's if you have to move them, you can move them with a shinu, right? But you should definitely try. I'm not trying to give more jobs before Shabbos, but they should definitely be hung up from before Shabbos. Okay, can you allow to move something to prevent the malacha, like covering a light switch? You would be allowed to do that, even though it's not so simple because you're moving you're moving something on behalf of a muktza, but that's not really muktza. It's a kli shamalach v'le'isr. Yeah, so that's so then that would be okay. Yeah, I do have them typed up, but I don't have them since Muktza Yom Tov Halachas is very, it's very straightforward. Muktza is all over the place. So I am actually working on trying to take my notes and make them into to make it sound like it makes sense on paper. So yes, I am working on that. Yeah, if it's in the way, the towels, they're books, if they're in the way. So like other books, you can move them out of the way, you kick them off to the side, or try and pick them up with a shinui. Yeah, rotten fruit would be considered muksa on Shabbos. Yes, rotten fruit is considered muksa on Shabbos, but it can get in. You can move it because it's considered disgusting. So it's called graf sharei, which I think we discussed a little bit. We'll discuss it next week. But that's one of the heterim for moving muksa. If it's disgusting you and it's bringing bugs or whatever it is, then you'd be allowed to move it because we have a heter for moving muksa that's disgusting. Okay. Yeah, so we have to figure out a way of people to post the email so that we can send out or get a voting of what subjects. But I don't know. We'll have to figure out a way. We'll have to figure a way how to do that. Okay. A good talk, everybody. A good year, and everybody should be safe and healthy.